Stanford sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe,
who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was, and continues to be, of great importance to Native people.
We recognize that every member of the community has benefited
and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land.
Consistent with our values of community and diversity,
we have a responsibility
to
acknowledge and make visible
the university's relationship to Native people.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Matthew Tiews, Associate Vice President for Campus Engagement at Stanford University and Interim Head of the Vice Presidency for the Arts Organization. I am delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's session of the Artists on the Future Conversation series brought to you by Stanford Arts. So the idea for this series is really to bring artists into the conversation about our future and what we are co-creating together. The arts provide us with a special window onto our world. They present a different vantage point, a different way of observing, analysis, insight into the changing human experience in all its dimensions. Artists can imagine alternative futures and new modes of being and doing, and bring us in powerful ways into the perspectives of others. We believe that artists are catalysts driving cultural change, and that art truly has the power to change our world. So through the Artists in the Future Conversation series, we are determined to ensure that art is central to our discussion of our collective future. This is really for us about joining Stanford's history of forward-thinking and pioneering ideas to a vision for what is possible through the arts. This evening, we're looking forward to a lively and enlightening conversation with Njideka Akunyili Crosby and Thelma Golden. First, I'd like to thank Stanford Live and the Stanford Arts staff for their work behind the scenes to make this event happen. And of course, this series would not be possible without the generosity of Komal, Shah, and Gaurav Garg. And I'd like to invite now Komal, an avid art collector, former tech executive, board member of SF MoMA, Stanford alum, and longtime supporter of the arts at Stanford, to say a few words and to introduce today's speakers. Komal.
Welcome, everyone. Last week was momentous. Politics aside, the election results took us a critical step forward in the march for equality. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, with her biracial immigrant roots, gave us all renewed hope and vigor to vanquish any glass ceiling and overcome any systematic disadvantages that women and people of color have faced all along. This is then the perfect moment to introduce our first artist on Artists of the Future series, Njideka Akunyili Crosby, a powerful and accomplished artist who was born and raised in Nigeria and now considers Los Angeles her home. Njideka's lushly layered figurative paintings use collage and photo transfer to explore the nuances of her transcultural life and depict the challenges of occupying these two worlds, like many of us do. Her work is collected in almost every important museum, and she has received many accolades, including the MacArthur Fellowship. After coming to the US in '99, she attended Swarthmore College, where she discovered that she enjoyed art more than biology, so she went on to pursue an MFA at Yale. When I asked Njideka what she considered the most pivotal moment in her career, without hesitation, her answer was her residency in 2011 and 12 at the Studio Museum. And so, it is an honor for me to introduce the second speaker of today and the face of the Studio Museum for the last 33 years, Director and Curator Thelma Golden. Under Thelma's leadership, the Studio Museum has thrived beyond the museum facilities in Harlem to become the leading voice and international champion of African-American artists and curators. Thelma has also served on many art initiatives in the government under President Obama, including being a trustee of the Barack Obama Foundation Board of Trustees. Thelma has long fought the crusade for diversity, equity, and inclusion for over many decades. way before the art world started waking up to these terms. She has been a North Star to many of us, and I am fortunate to count Thelma as a mentor in my personal activism for parity for women artists and artists of color. Let me turn over to Matthew Tiews so that we may now begin the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Komal. And thank you, really, with great, great pleasure, to Thelma and Njideka for joining us today. Thelma and Njideka, let me bring you on to the virtual screen.
Hello, Matthew.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. Let's just dig into the conversation and maybe just start with a very big question. We're talking about artists on the future, and I would just love to hear from both of you how you think about the future and how you think about your work in relation to the future. And maybe, Thelma, let you start that conversation.
Well, thank you. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here, an honor to be part of this Stanford Arts program. Thank you, Matthew and the Stanford Arts team. And thank you, Komal, for your support that makes this project possible. I am so grateful. And Njideka, thank you, because it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you and your work. So the future. I think this moment has made us all be incredibly present, but when I think about the future, what I think about most is the way in which I understand the possibilities of the future through my engagement with art and artists. You know, I value the fact that through art and through artists' voices and visions, I am always in a space of possibility and imagining. So when I think about the future, I think both of what I think we all hope might be possible, right, in change and transformation. But also, I think deeply about perhaps what we have yet to consider. And that's where the space of art is so significant and important in my own life, and why it has defined the space that I've worked in for my entire career.
Oh, that was beautiful. And I also wanted to start by thanking Matthew. Thank you, Komal, for that lovely introduction. And Thelma, likewise, it's such a pleasure to be here in conversation with you. And I wanted to thank the Stanford Art team and everybody who worked behind the scenes to get this discussion happening and kind of take us through the Zoom things and all that. When I think about the future and the place of my work in it, something that is important to me now and will carry on into this future is like to unapologetically center Black life and like my experience as a Black woman. It's something that just is going to carry on. It's important now and it'll carry on into the future. But not just centering Black life, but to center it, the complexity of Black life and infuse every piece I make with love and with joy, and really just like the deep love that I have for my Black experience, and have that be something that drives the work, and make canvases or make paintings that are affirming of Black experience as being important, as being valid, as being worth celebrating, and just being something that gives me joy.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Njideka. Thank you, Thelma. Maybe we can dig into that a little bit more. And I'd love to hear just you talk a bit about your work, and as you think about your work and the way it brings joy and the way it brings joy to audiences, how that for you works within a context of cultural change, within a context of the sort of long arc of issues of racial injustice, and within the context of what the possibilities are that we might be able to build together. Maybe start there with Njideka, since we're just talking about that, and move to Thelma.
Can I punt it to Thelma while I get my thoughts together? Is that okay?
For sure, Thelma.
Okay, I'll make notes.
Sure. All right, Matthew, will you rephrase the question for me?
Yeah, so I think one of the really important issues that the work that both of you are doing is really connected to the broader questions of racial justice in our country. And obviously, this is something that has come up with incredible intensity over the course of the summer. Certainly with the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, many other Black people at the hands of the police, real intense thought both in the culture and within the art world about racial justice and where we need to go. And at the same time, that's work that you have both been doing for a long time and with a long arc. And I think really thinking about how that work that you do both connects to a moment that we're in together, but also into a longer arc of history and towards a longer arc of a future. So maybe that's start there.
Well, thank you. And I think in many ways you phrased in your question, the phrase of your question is some of the answer. I feel incredibly privileged to be the director of the Studio Museum in Harlem. As Komal said in the introduction, my first engagement with the Studio Museum was when I was a student at Smith College, an intern there in 1985, returned when I graduated from college and was a fellow for a year in the curatorial department before going on to work at the Whitney, become a curator there before returning to the Studio Museum 20 years ago in 2000. And so when I think about what it means to consider this moment, I have to cite it in history, because the moment we're in very much echoes the moment when the Studio Museum was founded. It was a moment of incredible social unrest where the demand for racial justice, economic equity, equality were all at the forefront in so many ways of where we were as a culture. And part of that imagined that our understanding of the culture could not happen without the arts. And so the Studio Museum's founding very much was an answer, but it also opened up a space of questions that the museum has continued to answer. But I also feel that my work fits in an arc in that in considering the arts made by people of African descent, we are speaking about thinking broadly and complexly about the complexity of Black humanity. And that is where my work fits. It is not necessarily in response to a particular moment, but part of this arc of history. And that history is the history of African Americans in the US, but it's the history of Black people around the globe. And the Studio Museum has always positioned itself within that discourse. And that's the trajectory, right, that my work lives in. I think Njideka and I both benefit from the fact that we are working in a moment that was created by others, right? Many often who are unnamed and uncredited, but who really did the work that allows us in this moment to have this public focus in museums and in the art world. But it's work that has been going on for generations. And we have the privilege in this moment of carrying it on and perhaps doing it in a more public way, but it is completely linked to what's happened before us.
Yes, and to jump on that, what I was thinking as you were talking is just thinking of generations and how my decision to finally go into the arts was also really bolstered by seeing other people of African descent doing it. When I got exposed to Nkechi Mutu's work, the moment I saw Kerry James Marshall's painting at the Yale University Art Gallery was one of those moments I'll remember for the rest of my life. And or even seeing Yinka Shonibari's work and immediately understanding the space he was talking about. And I think what happens is that for me, when I see people center their story unapologetically, it gave me like the courage to do the same for myself. And so I think Black artists have been dealing with, like Thelma said, with Black humanity, with Black life, and just like the complexity of Black life, Black love, Black excellence, Black creativity for generations. And I like to think my work exists in this realm.
Do you want to talk about any specific work in that context? I'd love to hear more about particular works that you would want to bring forward. And I don't know, Thelma, if you want to give a perspective maybe on Njideka's work from that perspective, and we can start the conversation there. Oh.
You know, I think Njideka has framed her project already so beautifully, right? This engagement with unapologetically picturing Black life, and in many cases, unapologetically centering her view and vision of the world through her paintings. So for me, Njideka, it'd be wonderful if you would talk perhaps about our second image in the lavender room. And maybe that will be a way for us to begin to think about your work and the way in which your voice and vision come to the fore in your art practice.
So this was finished in 2019, and I was invited to be part of a show about the Danish painter Wilhelm Hammershøi. And Hammershøi is someone I looked at a lot when I was at the Pennsylvania Academy, and also even when I was in graduate school. So for me, it was thinking of how to make a painting I wanted to make, but also wink or nod to Hammershøi's influence in my life. Hammershøi did a lot of paintings of interiors. He lived in the same place for most of his life, and all his paintings were inside this apartment, and usually of his wife or his sister. And there was something about this obsessively painting the same thing, the same space, the same people. And the more you look at his work, the more you feel connected to his life, because it was so intimate. It was such an invitation into someone else's world and experience. And that's something that I do in my work, is just wanting to bring people in a very intimate way. Like, you are in my living room, in my bedroom, in a lot of these works. So that's how this piece started. And so there are architectural elements that come from a Hammershøi painting, but the photographs on the wall are photographs I got from a friend in Nigeria whose uncle used to be like a news photographer. And he found all his uncle's negatives some years ago, and I got some of those. And so with this, I'm kind of creating a space that is referencing the past and the present at the same time. So there are references to like Danish painting and Western painting traditions, but I'm really taking ownership of that and talking about my space and my living room. And while talking about my living room in Brooklyn, this was based off my living room in Brooklyn, almost like creating portals in the work where my Nigerian space can come into my current space. Just really thinking of how, when you're an immigrant, no matter where you are, the histories and the cultures of where you grew up are always with you. It's simultaneous. So having this plastic picture on the table that comes from a photograph I took of my grandmother's table in an ancestral village, and having the historic Nigerian photographs on the wall, and really just doing this weave in and out of time.
Thank you for that image.
So one of the things that's so striking when you talk about that in Njideka is the combination between the intimacy that you're describing and the way that there's a kind of intimate connection with that room, and the sense of almost the kind of claustrophobia in a sense of that very close space, and then the breadth of the global engagement that you are really connecting to. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your sense of how audiences take that up, and what kind of reaction that seems to produce, or where you see that actually having an impact as people respond to your work, and if you have a sense of that from people's reactions.
Sure, talking about intimacy in my work, or just like the looking in. I mean, on one part, it had to do with the things I gravitated towards, the images I looked at, the people I responded to were making works that felt very intimate. So I knew that was or like something that I wanted or valued in my work. But it's also the work I'm doing now started when I was in graduate school. I mean, a little before that, but it really got developed when I was in graduate school. And I think there was I was somewhat frustrated by how little the people I talked to knew of Nigeria, the way I had experienced it. It's a very complex country. There's a lot that is wrong with it, but there's also a lot that is amazing and beautiful and vibrant about it. Like culturally, it's a very vibrant space. And so I knew very early on that I wanted to talk about that space. But it's like the line, you write what you know. I knew like a good way to talk about it was through my experience. And I mean, this also came with trials that failed. I did go through a period in grad school where I was trying to work around the same themes, but I was too broad, like kind of looking out, and it just didn't connect and it lost people. And I'll have studio visits where I'm trying to talk about a collage I had made, and somehow we end up talking about my personal pictures and my personal stories. And it became very clear to me that that was a way to do it. Like, I know what I know my experience, let me work from that. And actually through that personal, intimate experience, all these bigger global themes I'm interested in come in. And so far, from the feedback I get from people, that is working. So that's happening to know. Because there was a time I thought, why would anybody be interested in images of me and my partner and my family? But once again, talking about looking at other people, I think this is where literature was very important to me, to kind of see writers of African descent writing their stories and making it very personal. And once again, unapologetically centering what they want to center gave me a lot of courage to just do what I wanted to do and know that the story I wanted to tell was valid, even though it was just like the story of my family and my life and my experiences.
That incredibly visceral sense of your perspective and your experience that comes through. And Thelma, I think that's something that, you talked earlier about championing that with the artists that you have championed, and how important that is in terms of both representation, but also in terms of a broader conversation about experiences and lived experiences and how people can understand each other. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about that. And maybe if you have a favorite work of Njideka's in that respect that you want to talk about.
Well, yes, as a curator, I have always found it important, almost my own mission, to create space for artists' voices in their specificity. And Njideka's work is an incredible example of that, right? She's bringing us very specifically not only into her present, but to her past. The work in its process allows that. Her way of layering images that bring us both into the painting, but into other worlds through the images she uses, are a perfect example for me of that idea of how to think about work. Now, to your question of how audiences engage with it, what I see is that Njideka's works are very specific to her story, but they speak to people very broadly. People understand, right? The sense of intimacy, the sense of joy, the sense of the particular kinship relationships that are apparent. People respond to the fact that the works indicate a sense of a world, and they want to know more about that world. And I've watched that with audiences of Njideka's work all over the world, in works that are hanging in museums and exhibitions, but also in the incredible public works she has made. And what's so interesting is that they all do create this possibility that allows us to see the potential of painting, right? to speak broadly and to also go deep. Now, in terms of a favorite work, I mean, there are so many. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to watch the trajectory of Njideka's work from the time she was in our Studio Museum Artist in Residence program, working so hard and so diligently. I have long been inspired by her work ethic. You know, these paintings take not just so much work, but the level of conceptual thought that's matched with their making. Is incredible. And watching how she's innovated her own process and practice over the years has been a real gift. But if I were going to think about one work that I've had the opportunity to see over and over again, to spend time with and have it reveal itself to me, it would be the work in our collection, which is titled Nawantintí, and from 2012, and it's image number 3, if we might bring that up.
Oh, I'm chuckling about my work ethic at the Studio Museum. And it's true, I did work hard that year. But you know, everybody, we all have that one year we look back on and you think, my God, I worked hard that year. And that was it for me, because I lived by myself in Harlem. I was like 7 minutes away from the museum. And when you do the residency, you have full year access to the space. And the funny story I have from that year is I was there so much that the gas company called to ask if everything was fine in my apartment. And when I asked them why, they said, because there has been no reading in like a month. I was like, oh, because I'm always at the Studio Museum. But that was a wonderful year, and just in terms of creativity, it was a year that really pushed my practice forward. Because I had an opportunity most artists don't have till very late in their career, mid-career, which is I had a space where I could go in morning till night, Monday to Friday, and make work. And I had a stipend, so I didn't have to get a job. And just that was a year I felt there was the biggest jump in my practice. So this is one of the pieces I created that year. And so music is a big part of my work. I talk a lot about literature, but music does have a place, especially music I listened to growing up. So in the late 80s, 90s in Nigeria. And I keep thinking of ways to hint or let music seep into the work. And so with this one is the title. There was a very popular song by Nelly Uchendo titled Love Nwantinte. And now we're at a point in Nigeria where Love Nwantinte is almost like a slang. It's like the thing you use to tease people when they're being very romantic or holding hands or showing a lot of affection. So I wanted to kind of wink at that, because it's such a romantic setup. I thought I might as well just name the obvious. But also to talk about a love of place, love of the country I grew up in, love of the traditions I was raised in. And so because there was that music theme going on in this piece, a lot of the pictures transferred into the work. So the little photographs you're seeing in the background, a number of them have very strong music references. So there are album covers, including the album cover of Nelly Uchendo's Love Nwantinte. There are a lot of Nigerian musicians transferred into the work. And this is an image of these two characters are based off of me and my partner, and we're going to see a number of them, this Black woman and this guy. And with this work, I was trying to play with inside outside also, because the screen wall which is the wall with all the circle holes in it, is an exterior architectural detail, but this is clearly a bedroom. So with some of the works, there are just those little like contrasting things going on that kind of point to one, the space being constructed, and through the thinking of the space being constructed, that the world that you're seeing is a little bit made up, and it's a combination of different things.
Thank you, that's fantastic. I love the story about your time at the Studio Museum, and I'm glad that you ended up being able to save on your gas bill. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thelma,
And I wanted, sorry, was there one more thing about that work that I really like? I think it was the first kind of monochrome painting, or more monochromatic painting I made. So I had before I started this piece, I had gone to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and there was a Degas painting of someone coming out of a bathtub, and it had a lot of reds in it. And that was like the jumping off point for this. I was just thinking, it was like a challenge to myself. I want to make a painting that is almost all red, maybe red and one more color blue, and really thinking of the range of that, like cool reds, warm reds, hot reds and dark reds. Like how can you take this one thing and really expand the range of what you can do with it? And just a side note.
Okay. Thelma, you mentioned this was your favorite. Did you have a particular reason?
Well, I don't think I could pick a favorite, right? There's a range of works throughout Njideka's career that are resonant to me. I think of works themselves, I think of their themes, I think of the way in which they trace a trajectory through the many different ideas that she has worked with. But I picked this one because I have the privilege of getting to see this work. And so that thinking about it at that point in her career and being able to come back to it. I remember seeing this painting when it was being made, when it was first shown in her residency exhibition, and then, moving into the future as it has had a life. But I also picked it because it's a work that I have experienced with audience. And it is a work, again, that speaks to the human experience in the most powerful and profound ways.
One of the things that Njideka's story makes me think about, and the support that you were able to give through the Studio Museum to help, make a space so that the apartment could be cold, really speaks to the power of institutions and what institutions can do to help shape artistic possibilities, to help shape the future. And Thelma, obviously that's something you've felt and thought deeply about and worked deeply in. And I wonder if you can say a few words about where you see art institutions today, what they need to do, what they can do, and how they are in a position to contribute to a future that we might want to create together.
Yes, thank you for that great question. I again, feel very privileged to steward an institutional ideal that places artists at the center. Right? That's why our name is the Studio Museum in Harlem, because the institution from its founding moment thought about the idea of artists' work in process as sort of needing to sit next to presentation. So having the studios in the building and this relationship to artists, but it permeates the entire exhibition program and our collection. So I think when we think in the future, this idea of the relationship to artists, right, in real and full ways, that not only sort of privilege the idea of presenting their work, but being in community with artists to support them through their process, through the arc of their career, is something that I think institutions should have as part of their mission in really significant ways.
And something I wanted to add to that is that when I did the Studio Museum, there were 3 of us at the same time, and we all had studios at the same floor. So if you're talking about community, I mean, just the community at the Studio Museum was like multi-layered. So when I was in the middle of a work and I got to a dead end, or I didn't know what to do next, it was very normal for me to walk down one floor and hang out with the curators at the Studio Museum. A number of them are still my friends till today. It was also very normal to chat with Meleko, and actually through working in the space with Meleko for that year, I ended up learning a lot from him, because I didn't used to plan out my works as much as I do now. And just whenever I came into the Studio Museum studios, the first the first space belonged to Meleko, and mine was all the way in the end. So I got to see his work right before I went into my space. And just something about seeing him work daily and then talking to him about the ways he planned everything meticulously and the research he did, that's something that ended up being very valuable to my practice. So thinking of that year and how much my work developed, I also have to credit the community I built at the Studio Museum.
That's actually one of the questions that I wanted to think with you about next, in fact, is you talk about relationships. There's obviously an incredible opportunity for the arts to be part of building community in multiple different ways and in different kinds of trajectories. And certainly, sort of as you describe that community. And I wonder if you could say a few words, and maybe Thelma, we'll start with you, just about how you see art institutions or art works artists being part of building a community that is about human relationships, as well as about the institutional structures in which these kinds of work actually are demonstrated and presented and so on.
I think we've seen an important shift in the museum or the cultural institution world, where, in some ways we can think of these places as the bricks and mortar, right? The physical spaces people visit to view art, to listen to music, to see a play, to see dance, to watch a film. But really, when we think about institutions, they are really about community, right? The community that is formed in those physical places. And I think when we sort of reposition our thinking to center that community first, it really allows us to understand how important that is to not only our advancement of our particular institutional artistic goals, but the advancement of the culture at large. The reason I work in museums is because museums were such important places to me as a young person, right? Being able to go to museums, and through museums and art, being able to see the world in really broad and complicated ways allowed me to see and understand myself in broad and complicated ways. And I think that this idea of community building as an institutional imperative. We often talk about collection building, right? These, inanimate objects, but really, I think for many institutions, perhaps the more important role we can have is community building. And I think that when we understand it, particularly in a moment like we're in now, it's what I think is going to create the kind of transformation many of us would like to see in the cultural community.
Thank you for that. And Njideka, does that resonate with your sense of your work?
Absolutely, it does. And I mean, just to add to that, I think that was perfect and said everything I was thinking of. But also, just the community, a place like the Studio Museum builds is one that extends outside the museum. So when I started my residency, I had never lived in New York. I wasn't plugged into that world. The only artists I really knew were people who went to graduate school with me and undergrad with me. And within weeks or months of being at the Studio Museum, I really got a sense of community. Like every time there was an event, just the people who showed up and the connections you made. And when I think of so many people I know from my time in New York, it actually leads back to the Studio Museum. I mean, I keep joking, like so many of my roads lead back to the Studio Museum, and it's really true. I ended up doing residencies because curators I met while I was at the Studio Museum nominated me, or even working with Victoria Miro. It's a long story, so I won't go into it, but it actually traces back to the Studio Museum, the connection that led me to meeting the director of Victoria Miro. And even apart from all that stuff, just I know I'm talking of things like gallery connections and residencies. I think what's most important about the community is just to the encouragement, because also it's a world where it's difficult as a person of color. I mean, things are changing, but things are changing slowly. And so to have that community that encourages you, that loves you, that props you up when you feel doubt, when the world doesn't believe in you, when you have a very terrible racist interaction, and you can talk to someone who understands what you're going through. That is very important. Just a side note.
Yeah, no, that's great, and really important. I wanted to get back to one, and I think we'll have one more question and then move to questions from the audience. But one word that both of you used, which I'd love to hear more about, is joy. I think both of you talked about the role of joy and the importance of joy in your work, in the work that you do. And I would love to hear about maybe sort of emotion more broadly, but specifically that word that you brought forward. And maybe if there's a work, Njideka, that you wanted to share that relates to that, that you wanted to talk about, we could go there as well.
I was thinking any of the works that we haven't seen yet will do. If you just put up one, I'll talk about it.
How about image number one? I'd like, Njideka, I think maybe framing, and thinking about this work around joy might be a way for us both to respond.
Sure, let me see. Yes. So this is a painting that is based off of a party I would have attended when I was young. So this is based off a party at my neighbor's house. We lived at 7 Umezebi Street, which is actually in a part of Enugu called New Haven. People always think it's a play on New Haven, Connecticut, and Enugu, which is where I grew up. But I did grow up in New Haven, Enugu. And I think with joy is such a radical thing for me, like not just joy, but a celebration of self and culture. And I mean, it even goes farther back than my lifetime. Nigeria used to be a British colony. And one of the things, I mean, it's like one of the terrible things that happens when a country is colonized is just the people who live in that country. Just thinking of my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, being made to feel that they are not good enough. They are somewhat inferior, especially their cultures, their traditions. I saw that in my parents' generation when I was young, how there was a correlation between being anglicized and being like upper class and like being someone who moves away from tradition. The more anglicized you are, the more respect you get, the more upward mobility you can have. And it was such a dangerous mentality for the country to be in. And in my generation, it's really nice to see people of my generation stand up and reject that. Reject it, but stand up and feel like it's time for us to tell our own stories. And you see this happening in literature, in music, in fashion, in movies, in art. And so there's something so important about this celebration of self that I find so radical in coming from a space where for a long time before we got independence, people had tried to keep us down or to make us think we were not important or our lives didn't matter or we were inferior. And even though it's just like been a slow crawl away from that, it's kind of nice to see it ramping up. And so when I make the works and I celebrate traditional aspects, because I grew up in Eastern Nigeria, but my dad was someone who felt that tradition was important. So he used to send me to the village during weekends and during summers to spend it with my grandmother, who never left the village, didn't speak English. And so when I make the work, I'm celebrating the life I grew up in Enugu, but a lot of it is also celebrating her life and the things I learned from her and the experiences I had in the times when I went to the village. So that's why in some of the works, there are lots of transfers that come from that time or that type of experience. So some of the transfers are not my pictures, but I look for pictures that speak to that experience and that time. And in some of the characters, there might be nods to that as well, like the girl in the background holding the cup, has a threaded hairstyle that I would have had at that time if I went to the village.
Thank you so much. Thelma, do you want to add anything on the topic of joy on this piece?
Sure. Well, I will add maybe opening the lens out from that Njideka just shared, but it's often been said in this kind of consideration of Black culture that joy is resistance, right? Mm-hmm. Joy exists in the face of what we can understand as the experience of Black people globally under colonialism, oppression, slavery, racism, and that can be a way we can speak about this moment we're in now, but historically. So when we think about joy as an act of resistance, it takes on power in ways that allow us to see and feel, right, the sense of life spirit that informs so much of the culture. You know, what's important to me in this conversation with Njideka and her work over the years is the way in which we are also having a cross-cultural conversation, right? And being able to speak about these different Black experiences that are all so related. You know, we're talking about, in some ways, in the context of what's happened in this country very recently, but we're also sitting in the space of what's going on in Nigeria right now as well. So that to speak about the ways in which the historic necessity to fight for rights, to fight for equality, to speak to the sort of broad sense of self-determination is where a place in which, again, I find art and artists such great voices and such a way for us to kind of understand these experiences in reflection. And that's when I look at this work and understanding the way in which, again, it positions for Njideka a way to understand a past, but it's situating that past within the cultural, social, and political histories that she comes from, but resonate with the cultural and social and political history that I come from. This same party could have happened in Southeast Queens in the 70s as well, and would have had some of the same conditions, right, of history and culture and experience. And that's where, you know, the sort of power of this shared global Black experience and its opportunity to allow us, as Njideka says, to own these stories and begin to tell them in ways that give power to the past and honor our ancestors, right, in our own families, but more broadly, but also to position a world for the future, those who will come after us.
Thank you so much. That is an incredibly powerful statement. And our first section on, and let's move to some questions from the audience, and maybe people had an opportunity to submit questions in advance, and thank you all for those. We'll get to a few of them. And maybe start with one that builds a little bit on what you were just saying, both of you, which is really about young artists, and question about how young artists can stay motivated and positive in today's very uncertain world. And whether there were any times in your lives when you almost gave up on being an artist or working in the arts, and what made you overcome those feelings and be able to move forward. So maybe Njideka, we'll start with you.
Yes, and I touched up on this a little while. So being an artist was a hard-fought choice because I'm Nigerian. And I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, like my parents expected me to go to medical school. And I understand where they came from, which is I went to a secondary school that was very competitive. Only 2 people from my part of the country went to this school. And then my family won the green card lottery, and I got the chance to move to the United States and go to college here. So from my parents' point of view, there was just this feeling of so much has been given to you that you need to do something guaranteed with it. And art was seen as, you know, you don't know what will happen. And so there was a lot of pushback from family to not do art. And it was something I fought and argued with for a year. And so by the time I decided to do art, I was pretty unshakable. Like, my Nigerian parents had tried for a year to shake me and it didn't work. Why do I tell this story? Because the one time I remember sitting down in my studio and thinking, maybe I made the wrong choice. Maybe I should have gone to medical school. Maybe it's not too late. That happened when I was in graduate school. And that happened. I mean, it's one of those things that took me years. It was after I left, especially when I was at the Studio Museum, that I was able to look back and process it. And I think it was like, I'm jumping stories, but it all makes sense. I think when I was at the Studio Museum, it was such a loving, supportive space that it made me, sometimes you need to be in a good space to realize that like the space you were in before wasn't helpful or nurturing. Being at the Studio Museum what just made me think, like, this is what it feels like to be somewhere where you're loved and you're supported and people wish the best for you. And so now, why did I feel that way? So I'm making this confusing, but I will explain better. When I was in graduate school was the time where I questioned if I should do art and if it was the right thing. And I think I was struggling. I knew what I wanted to talk about, but the work wasn't where it is right now. I was doing a lot of experiments, trying out different things to find an effective way to say what I wanted to say. And I just felt very alone. I just had studio visits where the summary always ended up being something along the lines of, we don't know what you're trying to say, or we don't really know this story, or why don't you tell this other story? Why don't you? So it was just like a space that made me question my own interests, and it made me think that what I wanted to say was not important enough, or like, this is not what you should write about. This is not the authentic African story. And so I had a lot of that. It was a time where I had a lot of self-doubt. And I just felt, and I just didn't feel supported. So then you're in a space where you feel like people might not want you there, or people are acting as if they don't want you there. Then you start thinking, why am I even here? Maybe I should leave art. Maybe art is not what I want to do. And so for me, I actually ended up getting a lot of that support outside the art program. I took a class with Dr. Hazel Carby, who is phenomenal. And it was a class on African and Caribbean diaspora literature, and actually seeing people doing what I wanted to do, but doing it in stories and in literature. And so it was that moment of, this is valid. This is valid because this person is doing it. Edward Danticat is doing it. Marlon James is doing it. Like, how are you telling me that this is not possible? And so that's when I had that moment. And this year has been heavy. It hasn't made me question wanting to be an artist. I've not had that feeling again since grad school. I know I'm where I'm meant to be. What has happened this year is just a lot of, sadness, as I'm sure a lot of Black people have been. It's been very emotionally heavy because one, it started with the isolation of COVID. I have 2 kids, so just having to really cut back on work, to help with childcare at home. And then finding out that COVID was affecting mostly Black and brown people and poor people, and just the injustice of the people who work so hard and get paid so little having to bear this burden again. And then just the non-ending videos of Black people being harassed, murdered, brutalized. It was a lot to deal with. And it took me months to get back into the studio. I was telling Komal yesterday that I started this piece in February, and normally it should take a few months to finish work, but just, it was just mentally exhausting, and to even think of getting back into the studio and working. And so that was a time where I had to pause in doing art, and I almost had to, and of course, protest, fight, do what you have to do. But it was also a time where it was important, talking of joy again, it was a time when it was important for me to replenish my joy. So spending time with my kids, connecting to friends, spending time with community, and also reading a lot of, I know like during the summer, there was a lot of reading lists going out, and it was a lot of like, something that was important for me is actually reading fiction. I felt there wasn't enough said about reading fiction, because that's also a space of Black joy and Black celebration. Reading someone like Kiese Lehman and Jasmine Ward. And I keep thinking of Kiese had this tweet where he said, like, Black people, we deserve beautiful sentences. And it was so true. Like, there are some Black writers you read and you just feel special that you're centered in these like beautiful constructions of language. So that's what I've done the past few months. It's been a struggle to get back to the studio.
Yeah. Well, so I think there's a question that's very relevant to that. Maybe we'll turn to that one next. This is really a question about this digital world that we are living in, and all of us, Zooming today and having moved online. And, obviously the increase in digital interactions with artwork means that people have incomplete perceptions and understandings of what the art objects that they see actually are. But there's also ways in which more people can connect and more people can get exposed in ways that may actually be beneficial and engaging. And I wonder, Thelma, maybe turn to you and ask if what you see as kind of the blessings and the curses of this digital and virtual art world that we live in right now, and how you see that moving forward.
Well, I am deeply grateful for the digital art world we're living in right now, in a moment when in many places museums are still not open or open in a limited way. The opportunity to still have people be able to connect with art, I think, is important. I do agree that the digital experience is incomplete, but I think just as we exist in other spaces in the world with multiple ways into, right, the same version of an artwork, we listen to recorded music and know that it is not the same as live, and are able to hold those two experiences equally. I think that the opportunity for many more people to access works of art, images digitally, but even artist voices. I think, one of the great gifts of this moment is that it took away any privilege that geography used to give certain artists. So that the way in which, artists who lived in art centers obviously had more access to community, something we've spoken about, was equalized. And the ability for artists all over the world to interact and connect and find their community. The earlier question about what young artists should do in a moment like this, I often say that sometimes artists think of places, right? The museum they want to show, the graduate program they want to attend, the gallery that want to represent them. And I often say to emerging artists, they need to first find their people before they find their places. Because finding their people is what allows for the potential, right, of a community to help move you forward. So I think the digital moment has been a way for people to find each other in the space of art. Now, I do think that we are also going to see how digital tools have furthered a lot of what we've long talked about in the field about creating more equity, right? Because access often is what creates more equity. And the digital tools, more than anything, are creating a huge amount of access. And I think that is a great, great thing.
And Njideka, are you seeing the same thing?
Yes, and for me, this is actually a question I thought I had to answer for myself some years ago, which is when I was invited by the Whitney Museum to do a billboard. I come from that space of, but I do a lot of work on my surface, and I do, and it's true. I make the work thinking of somebody standing in front of it and seeing the nuance in the surface and the tactility, and seeing things that are transferred or things that are rolled. If the paint has marble dust mixed into it versus if a paint has crushed steel mixed into it. But what I had to think for myself as I was trying to decide if I wanted to do the project or not. On one hand, it's like, yes, people lose the surface and they don't see all that work you put into it. There is a way to move people across the surface. But what is really gained is reaching not just a bigger audience, but a different audience. It's like the museum going demographic is, there's a demographic that doesn't go to museums. And I was thinking of Dr. Roxane Gay and Dr. Tracy McMillan Cotton do this podcast called Here to Slay, and they had Kimberly Drew on it, and they were talking about museums. And something that came up in that one particular episode is how a lot of people don't feel welcome in museums, or even art galleries, or even spaces that are free. It's just, and Kimberly did a good job of asking why. I realized like they can't even explain why. They just don't feel that's a space that prioritizes them, that centers them, that welcomes them. And of course, a lot of this is tied to the histories, how historically those spaces kept out a lot of groups that are marginalized. And so for me, the reasons why I chose to do that is the same right now. And I think it's important for things to be shared in ways outside of the traditional ways, so that it can reach the demographic that doesn't go to museums, either because culturally they did not go growing up. I didn't go to museums growing up, or they don't feel welcome in those spaces.
That's great, thank you. And this may build, and we'll end on this question. This may build on what you just said, but the question is just this, and it's simple, and I'd love your thoughts. In this unprecedented year, what has given you hope for the future? And you may have already answered it, but if you have more, please add. I think we all can use the hope that we can get. Thelma, let's start with you.
Well, yeah, I've answered where I started. Artists have given me hope for the future. Artists have given me a space to restore. Artists have given me a place to reflect in this moment. Artists have given me a way to channel all of the emotions that this moment has brought up: the pain, the grief, the sadness, the rage, the anger, the outrage. But most importantly, as has been the case through my whole life, artists have continually, through their artworks and through their words and through their voice, through their vision, given me a way to imagine a future. And that imagining, that creative imagining, that radical imagining is an inspiration that I walk through the world with every day.
Thank you, Thelma. And Njideka.
I just like had to follow up because that says definitely. I'll add so I have a lot of hope in my generation, and my generation is giving me a lot of hope for the future, especially when I think of the Nigeria I grew up in. So from before I was born right up until when I left Nigeria in 1999, it was all military rule. And it was like a country where, there was a lot of corruption, everybody complained, but there were never protests. And I don't say this in a judgmental way. I understand why there were not protests. People were terrified because the few times journalists spoke out, they disappeared. They either got sent letter bombs and they died, or they got executed, or they just vanished and nobody ever knew what happened to them. So it was a country, it was a space where dissent was not tolerated at all. And even though things are better, there are still vestiges of that, because it's like, even though we moved from military rule to civilian rule, a lot of people at high levels of government are former military rulers. So former military rulers and military men. So that's how they understand leadership. And so it's been a lot to see my generation, one, stand up, which is something that was rare, never happened when I was growing up, to see people stand up and to see people literally put their lives on the line to fight for the belief or the belief that Nigeria can be better, that we can have a country that prioritizes the well-being of its people, a country that has leaders that doesn't siphon all the country's income outside the country, to put their lives on the line for the future of their kids and like the future of people that are not even born yet. That was, I mean, really heartbreaking to see the violence that the rulers inflicted on the protesters. So it was a mixture of like being really heartbroken, but also feeling so much hope that things could get better. Because the first thing is to name it and to like fight for what you want, and to see that happening was really powerful. I mean, I felt so homesick because I wished I were in Nigeria and I was a part of that as it was happening. It just felt like, you know, sometimes you just can tell like what is happening now is monumental. It really is. It's still happening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing.
And also, so that's Nigeria, but also in the United States, seeing all the protests that happened over the last few months. It makes me hopeful because it means people know what they want and they're willing to speak up and fight for it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for your insights and for your work. Thank you both for being with us this afternoon, Thelma and Njideka. This has been a phenomenal conversation and really inspiring. And we are so grateful to you for sharing your time and for sharing your work and your insights and your vision with us. So thanks also to all of you for joining, and we look forward to being with you the next time around. Be very well.
Thank you, Matthew. And thanks to everybody who joined into the program. Thank you, Thelma.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night.